shortly. Smith Charles,
Present.
Wiper,
I am here.
Hoffman.
Present.
Here.
Right, you have a quorum.
Great. Next up, we have approval of the agenda. Moved by Commissioner Charles, supported by Commissioner Hoffman. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Public comment. Is there anybody here that wishes to come before the Finance Committee? Going once, going twice. Public comment is closed. We have no communications, so let's move on to item 6A, resolutions fiscal year 2023 second quarter financial forecast and budget amendments. I need a motion.
I'll move it.
Commissioner Wiper, supported by Commissioner Charles. All right, the floor is yours.
All right, good afternoon. First, I'd just like to thank the chair and the members for making themselves available for a special meeting. This item took a few extra days, but is important to get adopted on a timely basis. So the second quarter forecast, as described in the cover memo, I mean, we're basically right on target in terms of the budget and not using more fund balance than had been anticipated. That's a combination of being slightly down on revenues, but then also slightly down on expenditures. On the revenue side, we're forecasting that final revenues for this fiscal year will be about $4 million lower than had been budgeted. The largest factor there is with charges for services across a few departments, but the largest amount is the district court at $3.4 million, which the court is indicating is a function of having, fewer cases that involve fines, costs, and other assessments that are accrued to the county.
So that's 3.4 out of the total 4.2 came from the courts.
That's correct.
Okay.
On the expenditure side, we always budget for a certain level of favorability. That number is about $18 million between personnel and operating costs. We're currently forecasting that will actually come in about $22 million lower. So that's that difference of $4 million of expenditure favorability, which offsets the revenue side. This is spread across basically all departments. We always know there's going to be a certain level of turnover in positions and so forth. And departments continue to manage their budgets prudently. The two departments I would note that we're currently forecasting to be over expenditure at the department total level at the end of the year. First, the sheriff's office, where we have a forecast of about $750,000. That's the result of higher overtime costs than had been anticipated and budgeted. There's a few reasons for that, that the sheriff's office can probably speak to in more detail, but they've assured me at least, that they're on a track, to fill positions full time, and hopefully avoid this level of overtime in future years. So we will continue to monitor that as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year and make any recommendation on an adjustment to the budget that might be needed. The second is smaller at $200,000 in the Emergency Management and Homeland Security Department. That's simply a timing issue that the way the FEMA process works, we have to spend the dollars up front, and then it takes a number of months for FEMA to reimburse us. So that's not really an overspending issue. In terms of planned use of fund balance, the current budget assumes $66 million in planned use of fund balance. That's really the result of two things. One is the Raffaele settlement, which came before this committee and was approved. And then two is about $20 million in carry forwards and encumbrances that were approved by this committee for departments to finish one-time projects or purchases. So we're currently forecasting that the general fund balance at the end of FY23 will be about $195 million, which is about the 39% of our general fund balance. One, there are a number of sort of technical cleanup budget amendments where, grant funds have been received after the fact of the resolution, or there were resolutions moved that didn't have a budget amendment at the time. One large amendment that you may have noticed that I should make sure is clear, for the $39.8 million in costs related to the Raffaelli settlements, our independent auditors advised us that even though those funds were appropriated in FY 2023, they should actually be recorded as FY 2022 expenditures, because it was a known liability at the time that fiscal year 2022 ended. So I think I previously informed the committee those expenditures were recorded in fiscal year 2022, and that explains, why our fund balance came down to about $220 million for fiscal year 2022. So the budget amendment here reverses the FY 2023 appropriation so that we don't have a double count. So no real change in terms of the substance of that, it's just following accounting best practices. So those are that's the high level overview. The last thing I would mention is that, with the fund balance being lower than had been originally projected for fiscal year 2022, we're also making adjustments to the fund balance assignments here as a recommendation to you to get those assignments back within the 220.8 million. The big chunk of that is Raffaelli, which we had a fund balance assignment for, and then we previously discussed that there are these market value adjustments to our cash holdings, which are really only sort of a paper loss. So those funds will be gained back into the fund balance over the next couple of years as those investments are held to maturity. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions about.
Okay, I'll start with Commissioner Hoffman.
You said we allocated, I think it was $39 million for the Raffaelli case,
Correct.
and we spent all 39?
So the largest portion is the $38 million for the main, for the primary settlement. Those funds have all been transferred to the third-party administrator. So they are fully expended from our perspective as the books stand right now. Under the terms of the settlement, if there are funds that are not claimed at the end of the process, and actually, all claims had to be made by a May deadline, I think. Those funds are eventually returned to the county. Right now our attorneys are expecting us, are telling us to expect about $15 million to be returned to the county, which will happen, some number of months down the line once all the paperwork is settled.
Are there still pending lawsuits, or is it all the lawsuits have been resolved?
I don't want to speak as an attorney here, so I'm trying to.
I can speak to it.
Okay.
So, you talked about the big chunk, the Raffaelli case, that is settled. And then there were other cases that had opted out of that class because there was they thought they could get a bigger chunk and not have the Raffaelli class action lawsuit lawyers take into their money. And those, we entered into agreement for all of those. And so, I'm not aware of anything. If there are any pending there, we're talking individuals, relatively small number amount, if they're outside of that space. But I believe, we approved settling and addressing, and it wasn't a large number, it was 30, maybe it was 60 total cases. That was not.
And the terms of the $38 million settlement allow that the funds can also be used to settle any independent claims. So that's all contained within.
Oh, yeah, I figured it was for the whole thing.
So I haven't been made aware of. We can check with Corp Counsel if there's any out there. Is there any individual case that wasn't trying to resolve it? I'm pretty positive that we have the lion's share of all of them because we just went through all of them and said, it's the same terms, we're willing to accept, but we're willing to do this, are you willing to accept it? And they said, we claim settled those.
Well, you know how I feel. They should all got their money back.
I think you stand 100%.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Charles?
Thank you. Kyle, real quick, what is the difference between Schedule A and Schedule B?
You're gonna test my knowledge.
And while you're finding that, maybe it's more so for the commissioners, but, you know, we get the little thing, it's about this thick of documents about budget, and then we get this big super binder. And I'm just curious, how do all of those things relate to what we're looking at right now? It says that there are legal reasons why you're before us today, like quarterly, something in the language that you spoke about. So I'm just curious, is this a narrative to update what we've already gotten that's been printed and it's in the binder, and we kind of use this as the most latest and greatest?
Exactly. This is the process to do two things. One is to make sure that everything's on track in terms of both revenues and expenditures, which is the piece that's required by state law that every local government do. And then, you know, the amendments you're seeing are things where the budget needs to be cleaned up for one reason or another, you know, to make adjustments to that adopted budget that the board adopted last September.
And so, based on just what it says, we're recommending to the board this fiscal year 23 second quarter financial forecast and budget amendments.
Right.
So that means in budget hearing time, how does this relate to that? I just want to make sure I'm clear.
Well, so in budget hearings, we're looking at next year's budget. Right.
Okay.
So some of the adjustments that got made in here, if they make sense to carry into next year's budget, they'll become part of that.
Okay.
Commissioner Woodward.
I think it's a great question. I mean, the amendments and adjustments, some of it are adjustments because we've decided to move some resources to accomplish certain things through the resolutions that we've adopted in the last few months. And it's being reflected to amend that budget to take those actions into consideration. So it's kind of like the budget's a living document and we're making the adjustments accordingly. From a budget perspective, and this is related to a question I was asked, and it's I think directly pointed to what you're asking about is like overtime. I mean, the sheriff's budget has always had overtime issues, and we've known that there's been a challenge to fill vacant positions, not just the sheriff office here, but law enforcement ranked broadly. This is $750,000. I've seen some sort of iteration of this almost like every quarter. Is out for 20 years. Maybe not, this is a little bit larger for a quarter. I think that sometimes that was the number for the year.
That's the projected full year.
And that's that is a projected for you, okay. To make those adjustments. So from a budget perspective, then I think it's an appropriate, ask to say, are we accurately reflecting what we anticipate over time based on our past experience? What has changed? I have anecdotal information that we've filled a lot of vacancies. We've put them in training. So while we have more officers on the payroll, they're going through training and they're not necessarily on the streets. And so we're still going to have to relying on overtime to fill the vacant stuff that's been out there. So, but asking those questions because, how do we make certain that overtime? And I wouldn't say it's probably not just here. I would look at Children's Village, particularly any 24 operation where it's been a challenge to fill those positions. I think that's part of the conversation in the upcoming budget. Does this budget anticipate that? And asking directors of those departments, what is your strategy to? Are we using I'm just using this as an example. Are we using overtime as a way to continue to perform these operations permanently, or is this? Are we going to get to a point in which we have to rely on it on a more limited basis and have said money set aside to accomplish that? What are those? And those, I think, are the appropriate questions for department heads to, have a dialogue with the board. And is our budget, and under Kyle's, team and everything, I think is doing a very good job in this kind of truth in budgeting. This is what our money coming in is, and this is how we're using it. And when we're at the end, we should be as close to zero as possible. And we have to start pulling numbers from other things. How do we tighten that up to get a more accurate picture? So it's those type of questions. I think if you look at the individual amendments, some of them are, we passed this resolution and this amendment actually adjusts the budget because of a resolution that we passed. Some of these other unexpected things or slow delay in getting funds in, like Kyle was talking about with FEMA. I'm not worried about a shortfall. It's going to come. It's not reflected here. We have to reflect it in the budget, and we make decisions. But I would use all the quarterly reports and these amendments as a way of helping develop and probe questions for the budget hearings coming up.
I like it, and I'll just close with where it says favorable and unfavorable in the explanation a lot of times. For example, fire and ice put us in a favorable. Lack of use of non-department sundries put us at an unfavorable to the tune of about $417,000. So is that something that you look at, Kyle, and be like, oh, the sheriff is $750 short, no one's using sundries, so we just plug that in over here? Is it just that simple, or?
It's not necessarily a direct one for one, but at the end of the year, there will certainly be areas where expenditures haven't been at budget, and that frees up dollars to plug, something like the overtime role.
Okay, that's all I got for now. I mean, I could ask many more, but I want to be mindful of time.
Good question.
This is very arcane, but actually, the Government Finance Officers Association discourages you from using the word favorable, not you, us. So we should figure out a way to rephrase this. I mean, the point is, dollars are appropriated for a purpose. We want people to spend them in as cost-effective manner as possible to accomplish those purposes. So it's not necessarily favorable if you haven't spent the money, but I just had to point that out, because I attended a webinar where this was.
As long as it doesn't result in more words.
Right.
I
You can call it whatever you want.
The finance guys.
Okay, I think Commissioner Weipert had a question, then Commissioner Cavell.
Thank you. And Dave kind of touched on it, was about the Sheriff's Department on the 749, but I mean, the items that put them there are turnover, vacant positions, and people in the academy and training. So that is ongoing. I mean, it's across the country. It's law enforcement's, nobody's going into it. I mean, they're doing job fairs and trying to get people. And so that's, even though that number's significant, it's explainable. And
Yes, I agree.
and then the 207 on the emergency management, homeland security, that's just the timing, right? So it's
Pretty typical.
so.
Okay.
So all in all, it's not so.
Commissioner Woodward.
I would just like one other thing, and for the budget committee is to think about as you're going through the budget. I think it's important to look at are the fees that are being charged, and we certainly don't want to, burden particularly working families with fees, but the service that's being provided, to the extent those fees can be paid, are we capturing the fee that's necessary to provide that? I'll give just one example, and I don't know exactly where all the fee revenue is lowered and across what departments. I mean, certainly if there's less real estate moving, there's gonna be less transfer fees that are coming in. With our restaurant inspection process, part of the process, 2 inspections every 6 months, but if you have to have repeat visits, the nominal fee that's charged by no means covers the compliance. And this is something I've been working with and trying to work with the health department to say, what is that number? You get 2 free, we need to fix these little things, we'll come back out, keep that at what it is. But if for repeat offenders, pay the full cost of sending out the sanitarian, those types of things. So I think it's actually something for the budget committee just broadly to look at. Adoption fees and all those types of things, the license fees for dogs and what have you. We have some increased costs at the animal shelter that we used some ARPA dollars because we aren't able to rely on trustees to provide some services. We know that those dollars are gonna come to an end at some point. What is the plan and we brought in personnel because we couldn't find the personnel to clean the kennels and all those types of things. So we're gonna have to come up with additional revenue somehow if we're gonna maintain those levels of services in year 27, 28, and 29 and beyond. So those are things for all of you to work on.
All right, Commissioner Cavell.
Yeah, I was listening on my way in, so I think I caught most of what you were saying. Just first about the Raphael, you said you expected some amount to come back? So 39.8 million was set aside to go out, appropriated.
Right.
You expect some of it to not be used up, you said?
Again, under the terms of the settlement, if the amount of claims which are at 100%, so you get everything back, if you make your claim, if those claims are less than the amount that's been agreed to for the settlement, the dollars returned.
Okay, when do we find out, when is like the last claim going to be made?
So the claim deadline was sometime in May, so we have a pretty good idea what that number is. The attorneys are saying roughly 15 million plus or minus, don't hold me exactly to that
Sure.
number,
Okay, of going out or staying
of
with?
coming back.
Coming back, okay. Well, that's encouraging. Can you give an example of what the $20 million or $19.9 million in carry forwards and encumbrances might be?
Sure, so I mean, we can stick with the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office manages their budget, knowing that they have equipment that has to be replaced, every, 5 years or 3 years, depending on the kind of equipment. So they manage their budget to be able to make those equipment purchases. In some cases, they may have started down the road toward a purchase, but it hasn't happened by September 30th.
Okay.
So we allow them to carry forward those funds, so that the purchase can be completed in the next year.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. And then to kind of what Chair Woodward was saying about the fees going down, this is my last question was, is this just the $5.5 million in lower forecasted charges for services and the 3.5 coming from the district court? Are those just kind of like happenstance things, or are those policy and that's like a welcome shift?
I think that's, in the budget we present to you next month, you're gonna see a permanent reduction in the estimate for that revenue for the district court.
Okay, that's
And I
awesome.
think the court can speak more to the details, but to some degree it is a function of state policy changes.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Very good. Anybody else with questions? Okay, I want to make a point that Commissioner Woodward has showed up to be ex officio, and we now have a full complement of
I
commissioners.
can leave now.
except for-
I was just here to.
Well, it was helpful to have you because you have some historical perspective that helps in the discussion, so thanks for coming. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and prompt the vote.
This is on tonight's agenda then.
Yes, it'll be, this gets moved to tonight's agenda.
Tonight's
right?
agenda.
Okay.
You have the liaisons here on hand.
Okay, excellent. Next up, item 6B, fiscal services fiscal year 2022 deficit elimination plan. I need a motion, Commissioner Hoffman, supported by Commissioner Charles. You say deficit elimination, that starts getting scary.
And I was just about to say, that's a very scary term, so let me just explain what the situation is. This is a technical thing. Each local government in the state, as they close their books and issue their financial report, if you have a deficit showing in any of your funds, you have to report that to the state and provide a plan for how you're gonna resolve that deficit. Obviously, there are communities that have gone through that with their major operating funds. We're obviously not in that situation. So we have 3 funds that, as we close the books for fiscal year 2022, are technically in deficit. It's the fund of the court fund. It's the fund where smaller grants are held and accounted for. And it's the Lake Levels Act 146 fund. In all 3 of these cases, obviously the facts are slightly different, but in all 3 of these cases, it's simply a matter of expenditures were made in anticipation of reimbursement, from a grant, or in the last case from an assessment. So we've confirmed in each case that revenue will be received in fiscal year 2023, and the deficit will be resolved. And we're simply reporting that to the state, and that report requires your approval before we send it. So happy to talk about the individual pieces, but that's the high level description of what's going on here.
Okay, I'll open it up to the commissioners. Commissioner Cavell.
The friend of the court, we just did this in committee like a month ago, right? They're like 5-year plan of a grant application to the state for
I
funding,
think
so that's what you're
correct,
saying?
yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Commissioner Woodward?
I mean, I'll just speak to like, so like these lake levels, and the Water Resource Commission we often show up on this because the revenues in those funds were not in, the assessment hadn't been made to recover it. I know that WRC has worked very hard, and I'm glad to see WRC themselves. I mean, these are the lake boards, right? These are not the drain boards. Bush Lake, yeah.
It's the lake boards.
So it's but it's similar. I mean, I think if, in order to make sure it doesn't ever show up on this sheet, there needs to be enough money when the dollars get expended before, if an assessment's gonna have to be made. And so, WRC regularly showed up on these numbers just because of the timing in which the dollars come in and the monies were expended. I think the explanations for every one of these is, I think, more than reasonable, and just because of the timing of the expenditure and where the revenue comes from.
Thank you. Commissioner Hoffman?
Yeah, that is worth noting that the funds for these lake board improvements come from the residents who live around the lake through special assessments, and it might go through water resource or whatever, but it doesn't come out of their budget. It's a separate assessment for homeowners.
Yeah, if you happen to
It just falls
sit on
under
a
the
lake
lake
board,
board.
that's
The
one
lake
of the
board is,
decisions you make.
falls under the umbrella of
It's
county
like that.
government, so we have to.
Yeah, I used to have Walled Lake, but now Ajay has. Charlie?
So then, well, that brings up a question. So I thought the county's long-term revolving fund would have just been something at the county that like we have as a pot of money, but is that a lake loan fund, or what is our Oakland County's long-term revolving fund?
I'm gonna have to confess, I don't have those details at my fingertips since this is a transaction that occurred in 2010.
Okay.
But we can certainly gather the facts.
Okay, sure, thanks.
Each lake has its own assessed value.
Right, but this says if there's a county long-term revolving.
If memory
fund,
serves
so-
me correctly,
We could loan money.
yeah, well, I think if memory serves me correctly, it was WRC and these lake things, just because of when the assessment comes in and when the work that has to be done, that they were popping up all over the place. And this 3 fund area used to be much bigger because it outlined a whole bunch of other things. So, and I'm really pulling the back of the memory case, but Chris Long and
Chris is
Whiteford,
here.
yeah, but I think we actually we set money aside to be able to get
That's
in
what I
front
think
of it. And
then the
knowing
money
that
comes back and pays
into
them
the
back.
fund, and then
Yes,
so it's
that's
a
what
way
it
of
is.
using this pot of money to try to keep some of these off and somehow
And get 'em
this little
going.
deficit still managed to sneak through.
Right. If Cheryl could double
They pay
check
those
what
back.
that
Yeah,
revolving.
there's been like, there are hurry on a dam repair or something, and they can't assess it fast.
It could be they went
That's what
over,
this one
what
is.
we
Said
probably
there was a
gave the
dam
money and it
that
went
had to be
over before the
replaced.
SED came in, or the lake assessment came in.
We've been at a Friday meeting on one of yours.
Yeah.
A Friday meeting, they give $50,000.
Yep,
Wow, you guys remember the day of the week.
See, back 2010,
Yeah, I think that's been it's
14 years ago.
so that's what it is to get the project going.
Charlie was in middle school.
That's true.
You did?
No, you were in middle school?
Oh,
2010?
You're kidding.
No, I wasn't in middle
We're just
school.
teasing.
No, because that's only 13 years, you'd only be,
Back on track.
yeah,
I
20.
got grays now, I just got my hair cut, they told me about my grays.
All right, anybody else on the deficit reduction plan? Deficit elimination plan. Okay, if not, let's prompt the vote.
They brought that style back.
About 15.
I like that style, because I think that is.
Motion carries. All right.
I love this.
Next up, we have item 7, public comment. Is there anybody from the public who cares
Yeah,
to
that's a
address
good
this
one.
committee at this time? Seeing no one, I will close public comment. Is there any other business? Seeing none, I will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
So what do we do?
Here comes